So I thought for the first thing I'd like to do is, and for those who don't know, his new book is titled The Challenge Culture: Why the Most Successful Organizations Run on Pushback. But before we get started, Nigel, your Dunkin brands have been in the news lately. You guys dropped donuts.
Yeah, it's funny, that caused some confusion this morning because someone came up to me and said, thank you for dropping the donuts. And I thought they were talking about us dropping off some donuts for a show. But yeah, we made the decision 2 days ago. We announced it. To be brutally honest, we were both delighted and staggered with the pickup. I mean, it was on every national news program. It was on all the evening shows. You know, one of the things that's been really good about Dunkin, we don't take ourselves too seriously, and we're delighted when we're on one of the O'Brien's or one of the other satire shows in the evening, because that means people are regarding us as important, but not too important.
Anyone on the inside challenge the idea of dropping donuts?
Well, yeah, so this week's been a really special week. Not only did we make that announcement, but we had our big convention in Las Vegas, 3,500 people, and it was kind of emotional for me because it was kind of my going out as CEO. They did a wonderful video for me, which really was special. And I'm still running international, and I had someone in the international session push back and debate it. But we did a year ago, and this is very typical of our management style, when we're thinking about something, we consulted. And we had international regional meetings, and I remember saying to people in a room, okay, so we're thinking about changing the name, modernizing it, going down to a single name like other people have. Let's take a vote on it. And the vote was overwhelming. So everywhere in the world, I think I did meetings in Latin America, Middle East and Asia, and the vote was really strong. So we did get a little bit of pushback, but absolutely minute.
Very well. Nigel, I'd like to know where this idea of the challenge culture concept came for you. You said it's been building, and then 2 years ago you decided to conceptualize it in a book.
Yeah, well, you and I were talking outside. Well, I never expected to write a book. I mean, and as it says in the first chapter, my wife, who's called Joanna, and having watched the hearings on TV yesterday morning, she's an ex-prosecutor, so I get prosecuted regularly. So the first chapter of the book is the fundamental question why, Joanna's question. So that kind of sums it up a bit, but it goes right back, I think, to when I was a kid. And some of this is in the book. When I was a kid, I worked for my father in the holidays, as we call it in England, or vacations here. And I always remember one day I was doing this very menial job of banging nails into blocks. And I had to do a certain number of blocks. And I finished, and my father came in, and he said, so why aren't you working? I said, because I finished. He said, well, look as though you're working. And I said, why? And his answer was, and he said this a lot, actually, because Y is a crooked letter. He hated challenge. So that's where I think it started. And then it really took pace probably about 20-odd years later. I was in HR for 20 years. I was at a company called Grand Metropolitan, which was a big British conglomerate. And we owned, in America, companies like Alpo. We owned Children's World, we owned Pearl Vision, we owned Hoobline, the wines and spirits companies, and in England we had betting shops, casinos, all kinds of stuff. And I was working with the chairman and CEO to try and put together his organizational philosophy, and he was famous for a phrase that I think he said to a journalist, and it sounds very threatening, light grip on the throat. So he wanted to write that down. I said, Alan, you can't write that. I mean, this just sounds too nasty and forceful. So he said, well, what do you think we should call it? So about a day later, I came up with the challenge culture. So it came there. But I think the thing really got into momentum when I was at Blockbuster, which was 10 very happy years of my life. And being at Blockbuster was a bit like being a target range, because every day you got up and some new technology was firing at you. And as I describe in the book, we may not have always challenged ourselves sufficiently. So I think it was in steps. It gradually came together.
Let me ask you this, Nigel. It seems to me in the corporate and the business world, maybe the 60s, the 70s, maybe part of the 80s was largely about, conformity, coming to some agreed upon standards, scaling it, building it, growing, and versus, say, the entrepreneur culture is, you look at Airbnb and Uber and Bird. there's rules and there's regulations out there, and the culture, I think there's a term they use at Uber, it will come to me, but that's sort of like an entrepreneurial challenge spirit.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look back in business, and by the way, I want to say very clear, the book isn't just designed for business. I want to say that right up front. And we'll probably talk about it later, because I've been on lots of not-profit boards and I've now got a sports organization. I think if you go back to the 50s and 60s, it was all about numbers. Everything was about numbers. And then I think there was all kinds of influences through the 70s and 80s, as you say. And the entrepreneurial spirit doesn't really come out in corporate America or corporate anywhere. It doesn't just have to be America. It's like a process. It's a slug. I think one of the great, and I've been very fortunate, I've worked for 4 franchise organizations. Now, it's not for everyone. Most people would find working in a franchise organization to be incredibly difficult. Because take it like this. Say we write the book together and we decide we're going to market it and then operate it, put it in the stores. Every inch of the way, someone's saying, I'm not sure I like that. Why don't you do it this way? Oh, God, that's not going to work. Oh, we tried that before. The franchisees are entrepreneurs within a brand, so they feel somewhat constrained, but because they've put a lot of money and investment in it, and often their life savings and even the house is mortgaged to support it, they feel they have a say. And I think what I've managed to capture by the challenge culture is the fact that they do have a say. As I'm sort of migrating, I'm still at Dunkin, as I'm migrating, I did a really interesting thing, did it 2 days running this week. I gave away 750 books, and I was doing speed dating, signing the book and talking to people. And I found out more by doing that than anything I've ever done in my life, because everyone had a chance to have their say within like a minute. And probably 40 people said, thank you for giving us a voice. They also said, this is going to sound a little bit egotistical, thank you for saving the business. But the thing that really hit me, someone came up and said, my son is a doctor, you enabled it to happen. Now, I think that's all because I allowed them to have a constructive say, because it's very easy in a franchise business just to push back and say, I'm not listening to you, we're the bosses, we're in charge. And I think that happens in most companies. So forget the franchise business. How can you get the same kind of challenge and pushback and debate within a normal organization? And let people, I like the way you phrased it, no one else has put it, let people think like entrepreneurs. When you work in a company, you should have the ability to think about the company, whatever job you do. And one of the things I've always done, say I go to a brand new company, I always say, okay, Ted, you're the finance guy, you're the marketing person, he's the HR guy. Forget your jobs, you're a business person. You're allowed to comment on operational points, you're allowed to comment on financial points, you're allowed to focus on product development, and that builds people's investment in the business, but it also allows people to be creative. And it's weird, I think over time, I just do it naturally. I can't write something without saying to someone, hey, what do you think? because you have to have that constant challenge process.
So take us back to your background in HR, where challenge, as you describe it, in some environments might be thought of as confrontation. How did you handle challenge when situations were brought to you in HR, or how did you encourage people to challenge earlier in your career?
Well, yeah, HR is an interesting function, and I say this in the book, so it may be slightly controversial. I think actually in the UK, HR is a bit more progressive than it is in this country. I mean, a lot of people see HR in this country, and I think it's changed, thankfully, as an administrative function, you know, for salary increases and benefits and things like that. I see HR as truly a strategic function because the people are, and I know everyone in the world says this, people are the greatest asset, and they're a resource. And in the current economy, and I was talking to our franchisees about it yesterday, people are incredibly important because we've got an unemployment rate of 3.9%. In a year's time, it's forecast to be 3%. I think most economists agree the unemployment level is 4%, so we're below that. In the area where I live, which is Boston, the states of Boston, New Hampshire and Maine, the unemployment level is below 3% already. Our franchisees claim they can only get 60% of the people they need. So this whole people thing is very important. So going right back to answer your question, when I was at Rolls-Royce, which was in 1975-76, I worked on the shop floor, and it brought to life something I learned at college. And it's mentioned on page 20 and 60, I know those pages, in the book, as a guy called Alan Fox wrote a paper about trade unions and management. And essentially what he said in the book was that there's two ways of managing this. There's the unitary frame of reference and the pluralistic frame of reference. The unitary frame of reference is everyone believes they've got the same economic outcome or assumptions. That doesn't happen. The pluralistic frame of reference is what happens in most corporations or most situations, because the union want to improve wages, benefits, security of their members, and management obviously wants to make the company more profitable. So the pluralistic frame of reference is very, very sensible, because what it recognizes is reality. It's no good saying we're all on the same page, guys, when we're not. So the job of management is to bridge the gap. And I think that had a fundamental effect on my thinking. And in HR, I always try to find a win-win. I mean, you know, I won't go into all the examples we have in government today, but I think a lot of the things that we read about happening in the world right now are not win-win. I mean, people want to go out of a negotiation feeling good, and I think the way you do that is to find a win-win situation. So, not quite answering your question, coming right up to date, there's a whole chapter in the book about how we shared our revenue with our franchisees when we went outside our stores and put coffee on the shelves of supermarkets. It's called CPG, Consumer Products, and that's been very successful. And going back to my speed dating book signings, I had several franchisees say, thank you. No one else would have done that. But what's clear there, you're challenging the status quo, but you're bridging the gap, and everyone wins.
There's something you talk about in the book that I think connects to the experience you had with the speed dating signing books, is these Ask Me Anything type sessions where a CEO or a chairman or senior leadership goes in front of a company and essentially opens up and people can ask any question they want. Describe some of the most tense moments you've had in those and the most fruitful moments you've had from those.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, the first thing I would say, I can't actually remember many tense moments, which I think is important, because effectively, say it was this group here. I would start off by saying, hi everyone, welcome to this coffee chat. We run these regularly. Make sure you look around because you will never come together as this group again. Then we run around the room and just say your name, how long you've been with the company, which is important. I'll come back to that, and what you do. That's all we need. And that's the only time we mention anyone's name. It's just to get everyone introduced. I then go in and say, look, you can talk about anything you want. You can talk about sales, you can talk about marketing, you can talk about Baskin-Robbins, you can talk about the dipping cabinets on Baskin-Robbins, you can talk about international. But then I throw in a few subjects that people kind of, wow, it's been rumored forever that certain companies are going to buy us. I encourage them to talk about that. I talk about perhaps we should go out and buy someone. I then say, okay, well, there's this rumor in the paper recently about this. You can talk about that. I even then say, okay, let's talk about the Me Too movement. And then what comes out of that, and this is very important, we have a discussion. It is not a Q&A of Nigel. It is a discussion. So if something came up, and I might say, okay, good point. What do you think over there? You work in this function, which is why it's important to get some information. What do you think about it? So it's all going on. I often describe it as a TV talk show. And I have someone who's independent from corporate communications write the notes. We don't say who's in the room. And we've done some pretty good stuff. I mean, we changed our whole parental leave program as a result of this. We changed the way that people could commute, because we're outside of Boston, to the company. I've had great ideas that we built into marketing. We've had people who've challenged the way that we do some of our operational procedures, tried to simplify it. I mean, so many good things have come out. I can't think of any bad things. What is fascinating to me, the one really interesting thing is I must have done 60, 70 at work, and I've also done it with franchisees. I can't think of more than 2 subjects that have been repeated. I mean, there is such a breadth of thought out there. We've never gone through the same subject. I think it's happened twice. And to me, that's kind of an amazing thing. It shows that there's a lot to talk about.
I just want to go back to the entrepreneurial culture and companies that come from those. So a startup seeks funding from venture capitalists and private equity firms and so forth. And these investors want an outcome. They want to make money. So I think they are built in their DNA and their nature of that relationship with them as an investor and as a startup company is to challenge you on premises and decisions you're making because they want a good outcome because that's a better outcome for them. Do you think that has made it a little more mainstream and easier, the whole concept of a challenge culture sort of into older state companies when they see that kind of activity happening? And vis-a-vis, for example, larger public companies who similarly get challenged in the media and so forth. Is there a wave here?
Well, firstly, I'd like to believe there is. I think it may be too optimistic to believe there's a wave because I did some book signings last week back in Boston. And one of them was kind of an interesting session. We had a group, and the whole group ended up solving this couple's problems. Not together. I didn't move into marriage therapy or anything, but they both worked for the same company. They clearly had a very bad boss who didn't realize that the turnover was really created by him. And by the end of the evening, the whole group was helping this couple solve the problems at work. It was interesting. That's such a broad and great question. In the book, I talk a lot about private equity because the first 2.5 years I was at Dunkin, we were owned by Carlyle, Bain, and T.H. Lee. And they are challenging. But I do a session to private equity firms. I'm not convinced they all fully understand the benefit of people cultures. I think sometimes it's too driven by the financial side, and you want to build a business because what normally happens in an IPO, and a lot of people don't realize this, an IPO is not like an event where you sell the whole company. You sell parts of it. We went out and sold about 30%. and the rest actually got sold the following year, which, to be brutally honest, was a surprise to me, which meant the PE people dropped out. And I think they've regretted it ever since, because they sold at 30, and when I left this morning, the stock was 74. But I think what doesn't happen in most companies is you are not allowed to challenge. Now, let me just step back. The key words are the challenge culture. Everyone focuses on the word challenge. In many ways, that's not the right focus. The right focus is culture. To me, most companies don't have good cultures. They don't think about cultures enough. And I challenged our franchisees this week very heavily, because we have 2,000 franchisees around the world. And basically I said to them, how much time do you think about managing people? And in my closing remarks yesterday, I contrasted what it's like to be at Dunkin and the football club I chair in London. We spend 90% of our time in the football club talking about people. Now, sure, a lot of it is talking about players and coaching and all that stuff, but it's also the commercial stuff. And then I also pointed out that I bumped into a McDonald's franchisee who also told me he spent 90% of the time talking about people. I will bet my bottom dollar that most people don't spend anywhere near 90% thinking about people. So the point I make is that culture is critical, and culture isn't something you go down to the hardware shop and I'll have 3 cultures, please, and they take it off the shelf. A culture is something a bit like the birth of a baby. It's born right from the start. You have to support it. You have to nurture it. You have to develop it. And you have to, it's an ongoing process. It happens every hour of every day. Most people don't think about people and the culture they're creating like that. And I think there is often a conflict between the PE people or the venture capitalists and even the public and the culture in the organization. And I think one of the great things with the lack of people in the workplace right now is everyone's going to have to start thinking about the culture of the organization. That's the movement.
Challenge starts with a spark.
Yeah.
Tell us about the spark at Dunkin's with a gentleman named Paul.
Okay, so in the book there's a guy called Paul Tuig. So Paul's a really interesting guy, and he's a very good friend now. He's no longer at Dunkin. I happen to be a very big investor in the company he's at, which is Mod Pizza. And you've got more mods here than we have back. We don't have any in Boston, so you're very lucky. It's a wonderful concept. So Paul's background, and by the way, he would not be surprised if I say he's cranky as well. Paul joined the company back soon after I got there, back end of 2009. He's got a very interesting background. He worked at Burger King right from the bottom up, was a franchisee at Burger King, then went to Boston Market as a franchisee, went to Starbucks, left Starbucks, became the COO at Panera Bread, went back to Starbucks, and then came to us. He's got a wealth of operational knowledge. If you saw him and I, you would think like we're polar opposites. That's probably why it works. I mean, he's one of my best friends now, as I said. So I brought him in, and I was somewhat frustrated that the previous management team lacked the intensity that I expect and the questioning. They'd clearly learned that the way things operate is you have the boss, you have a meeting, you discuss what's happening, but you never think about how you can improve. And the word challenge is essentially how do you get better business solutions by thinking how you improve. I mean, I should leave here today and think, how could I have done that better? Most people don't do that kind of stuff. So anyway, in our meeting, we were talking about G&A, which means overhead, and I was saying, look, I think we need to reduce our G&A by this. And the spark that you talk about is that Paul said, well, hold on a minute. What you're suggesting is nonsense. Now, think about that. What you're suggesting is nonsense. Most companies, you couldn't say that to your boss. So so the audience here, I think they're all nodding. I mean, that's kind of a taboo subject. And I find that frightening because it means that the boss can't be challenged. And I had an interesting chat with someone last week and talking about the book, and I said, so can your boss be challenged? Oh, he thinks he can, but he can't. So what I think you have to think about in this is there's another stage. The boss has to expose himself. Now, this is not taking your clothes off. This is actually exposing yourself to the fact you may not be right, and there may be another way of doing it. And I think because I felt that no one would challenge anything when I first got to Dunkin, I needed someone, and we didn't plan it, and Paul pushed back so hard on me, it woke everyone up. So that was the spark.
So there conceivably could have been the risk that Paul got tagged rogue and, you know, lack of respect to the boss, all depending on how you handled it as his supervisor. Yep. and how the rest of the employees witnessed that being dealt. I kind of want to go back to your HR exec days. If you were in HR sitting in a meeting like that and somebody challenged a CEO on something publicly like that, I can't imagine any company where some eyes wouldn't be rolling and somebody might say, somebody needs to go have a word with Paul.
Okay, so that is true. However, the Graham Met, the company, the British conglomerate, with the light grip on the throat, I think you find that people, and I think that's when I first saw it in action where people felt they could. Now, I'm not saying everyone in the company did it, because they didn't. And I've got this theory, which is kind of controversial, so everyone will probably like it. There is a real difference between Europe and the US, and that is called employment at will. Employment at will was a really alien concept to me when I came here. And it's funny, even though we speak the same language, there are real cultural differences. I mean, another cultural difference, we touched on it earlier, is private companies. The UK does not have private companies. If any of the audience here want to go and look up my football team, Leyton Orient Football Club, which in America will be a private company, you can go and look at our accounts because it's all filed in a place called Companies House. It's a more open system. In the UK, just imagine if we had a cleaner who worked for the company for 12 years and suddenly got fired, he or she would get 12 months' pay under European statute. Same person here could be fired with nothing. I think that increases the fact that people feel at risk when they challenge. Because I've had many discussions, a bit like the point you raised, where if you challenge your boss, you put your job at risk. I think that is bad. A lot of people think, you know, people like me are socialists. Maybe some truth in that, but anyway. But I believe that people need to be put in a situation where they feel safe. Now, I'm not naive. In most companies, that doesn't happen. So I recognize there is a risk with the challenge culture. But I think one of the benefits of doing all the talks I've done over the last few weeks and webcasts and podcasts and whatever is my thinking gets better, I think. I think you need to do the culture first before the challenge. So I think it's easier to influence a boss on the culture and getting the culture better than the challenge. So I think the challenge thing needs to be eased in. And what I've said to some people who've come up to me, can you help me? I want to apply it. How do I apply it in the middle of the organization? I said, start with yourself and then start with your best friend and challenge each other. And then people will say, wow, why is this department doing well? Because we challenged everything.
Could you give us some more examples of how a leader or a company can embrace some of these ideals you're talking about and have a more open challenge culture?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think firstly at Dunkin it's easy because we've got franchisees, they challenge everything. I mean, and as I said before, most people couldn't stand it, but you know, you have to have a very open mind. I think I've got a whole chapter about boards. I mean, I think we're going through a really interesting part of corporate history now, where boards are on the rack with what's going on. I mean, we got today's example about Elon Musk and the whole thing about the SEC, and I don't know all the details, but based on what CNBC said this morning, he was offered quite a generous proposal by the SEC to settle that. And what really worried me about I mean, by the way, I got a Tesla. Tesla is one of the greatest inventions of the 21st century. Elon Musk, we will look back in 100 years and probably put him above Einstein and other great people. But what he did was intolerable. I mean, you can't just go out and say, I'm going to take the company private. And that's where the whole relationship with boards comes in. I have a board, previously private, public, that challenged me all the time. I think it's fair to say the board pushed us into the consumer products business. We found a way to do it. I think continually our board has been highly supportive but challenging at the same time. I mean, take some other examples. I've referenced all these in the book. Uber and some of the stuff that happened there. Now, the board woke up and is changing. Even have ads on TV talking about the culture. Good for them. They changed. Wells Fargo, another one that perhaps missed the mark. Probably some people here know more about it than I do. I think the huge example recently, which came out really after the book, was Theranos, with Elizabeth Holmes. So I think the boards have a key role. But I found the board has helped us a lot. So I've been in the fortunate situation at Dunkin, where we've had an unbelievably successful run through the whole time, that we've had all this challenge from the franchisees, all this challenge from the board, and also employees are encouraged to challenge. I think it says something about the whole approach that we've been so successful.
Are there industries that you feel are just too resistant for this, and that you'd like to see more happen in, without mentioning names of companies or anything, but specific industries that are just not ready for embracing this kind of culture shift?
Well, yeah, when I was back at Rolls-Royce in the mid-70s doing that shop floor labor relations stuff, it always worried me that people were working on engines for the year 2000. Now, I recognize this was 1975. So there may be businesses that are so long range, it's tough to do it. But I believe there are microcosms of everything they're working on all the way through where it can be challenged. I think everyone and everything can be challenged every day. Now, let's not get too crazy. I don't think you spend 100% of your time challenging. You perhaps spend 10% of your time challenging. And you and I had a discussion about the book industry. I knew nothing about the book industry, but it's been kind of interesting going through this process. And as an outsider, I would challenge some of the ways that books are marketed. Similarly, when I was at Blockbuster, I would challenge the way that some of the movies were marketed. I think what I would say is the world is picking up at a pace that we've never seen before. The world is smaller through social media, and I mean, it's a staggering number. There are 7.5 billion people in the world, but 2 billion monthly active Facebook accounts. YouTube is 1.9 billion. WeChat is about 1 billion. And on you go. So that speeds up everything. So I think the world is going to get faster. 5G is going to be transformational. And I think the next 10 years are going to make the last 10 years look like a snail's pace. I think that means everyone will have to challenge everything every day. And another controversial statement is that I think the days where you budget for a year in any organization may be in the past. I think you're going to have to budget for half a year because the world's moving that fast. So I think there's probably industries where the whole challenge thing struggles. the more I think about it, I think it's tough to believe that every industry can't be challenged.
What about the White House?
Well, okay, so I won't, I live in the great state of Massachusetts, where I think we have a pretty active political culture. But what's amazing about Massachusetts, despite the fact, it's a great place to live, and California and Massachusetts clearly have some common elements. One of the interesting things is we got a governor who is Republican, and he's got an 84% approval rating. I think that's an amazing statistic. I think he's probably an old-style Democrat, but he is labeled Republican. I think some of the processes in the White House are clearly very much top-down, and I think the president worked in the family business where clearly it was his way or the highway. I'm intrigued by how it actually works. I'm halfway through Bob Woodward's book, which I think people should read, because I think it's called Fear, if you don't know, but it's fascinating. And in there, the bit I've read about Syria is fascinating, because the president, which I would not have expected, was debating whether they should launch an attack on Syria, big, medium, or small. He went round the room, got everyone's view, it was allowed to be challenged. And then he even went a step further and said, okay, I've heard from you guys, let's get on the phone now. The captains of these, I think they were destroyers in the Mediterranean. So they had the captains of the boat on the phone. That kind of surprised me, because that's not the style I read about. And Nikki Haley, when the person wrote the anonymous letter about the chaos at the White House, Nikki Haley actually said, I don't have any trouble challenging the president. Now, I'm not saying his style is my style at all, so don't take that. I think he somehow tries to get challenged, but it perhaps goes against what he's done in his past, where he's basically run a family business. And I think one of the problems in family businesses is it gets so internalized and so paternalistic that it lacks what I call in the book the outsider-in approach. And I think that's somewhat what's missing there.
All right, before we go to the audience for questions, two things I want to touch on. You say communication in a challenge culture is a messy process. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, for a start, pushback can hurt people. We don't all naturally like it. And I used to do training years ago at a great American company called Parker Hannifin. I happened to be in the UK when I did it. And we always used to say that effective communications is truly effective two-way communications. And two-way communications involves listening. And it was interesting, we had the speaker, Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank at the meeting yesterday, and he talked about how all the companies he's invested in, how they do Shark Tank. Someone turns up and they say they're looking for $75,000 for a 20% stake or whatever. So he got all these CEOs together, and the number one thing he had on his chart was how important listening is. And so that's important. So the point I want to make about being messy is that most people, including me, find pushback and challenge tough to take. I'm no different from anyone else. If you told me now what I said this morning was complete crap, I would be emotionally upset. That's natural. The point you have to do is recognize consciously that you are going to get upset and try and get over it. And recognize that the greater good is to come up with better business solutions. Or if you're in a not-for-profit, solutions to raise more money or more treatment or whatever. Or in my football team, a more successful team in terms of ticket sales or performance on the field. So it is a messy process. And what people often do is if someone says you need to do this differently, they do not go back and tell them why they haven't done it. They leave, a 2000 phrase, a hanging chad out there. And one of the most important experiences, which I don't think is actually mentioned in the book, was when I first started working at Kraft when I was 22, I did an attitude survey with the University of Chicago in the UK for 2 years. So I used to go around with the survey details. We'd sit down, have a group like this, and we'd say, okay, so what do we think about this? What's this issue here? Supervisor isn't very responsive. And we'd discuss it. And we'd have a list of actions. And then once we had the actions, we'd go back and say, we're going to do this group. Those we're never going to do because it's financially irresponsible. These we're going to think about, and we will come back to you. You have to keep tying the knot. That's why I say communications is messy.
All right, and then my final question has to do with the business of sports. You own a football team in the UK, and it seems to me, and we briefly talked about this backstage earlier, the business ownership of sports teams and how leagues are run in our country are very organized, structured, and probably don't welcome much challenge. Could you compare how you run your sports club and how sports, how this notion of challenge can be helpful and otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, in this country, all the leagues are run as a franchise. So effectively, they're a subset of the total. Doesn't mean they don't have great games. I mean, I thought the game last night between the Rams and Minnesota was fabulous. The big difference in most of British sport, and well, actually it's not British sport, most of the rest of the world's sport is this thing called promotion and relegation. So just to explain what happened to us, my team's called Leyton Orient. I've supported it for 60 years next year. In 1962, we went up to the then top division, the equivalent of the Premier League, with Liverpool. We came straight down. They've been there ever since. We've been up and down the leagues, and because we had a pretty dreadful owner for 3 years, up until a year last June, we're in the 5th tier right now. The big difference that you refer to is owners here work together for the good of the league, and as a result of that, for each other. In the UK, it is just the opposite. And I've been shocked by the fact that people believe the competition on the field has to also include lack of cooperation off the field. Now, in our league, there's increasingly American owners coming in, and I think that's going to change. But I think there's good and bad of both systems. In the UK, I think the result of having this promotion and relegation is that it makes the whole season intense. I mean, so let's take Major League Baseball, and by the way, from Boston Red Sox have so far this year won 107 games. Hopefully we're going to win the World Series. But there's a bunch of teams that are really bad. That can't happen in football because they go down. And last year, the championship, which is the 2nd tier, the last week of the season, 11 teams out of 23 in that division were still involved going up or going down. That's true competitive sport. And I've said, and it's, it's not very well liked, the MLS will continue to struggle when they don't have promotion and relegation. But I think it's because here it's run, and there's a commercial concern, there's probably a historical passion over there. As I said, I've supported my club for nearly 60 years. Having said that, what we're trying to do is take the great things from America, put it in there, and so far so good. We're trying to do, most clubs in our league think about getting to the end of the season and surviving. We're trying to build a sustainable business. I'm delighted to say that we had record season tickets last year, record ever, record again this year. right now, after 13 games on the field, we're unbeaten, top of the league, and won 5-1 the other night. So I feel good about it right now.
Very well, so it's time for questions from the audience. Just a quick reminder, at Live Talks LA, questions generally start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are short. There's no such thing as a two-part question. Who has a question? I'll bring a microphone to you.
Good morning. I have a question about what's been in the news in the past week. So you're changing the name of the brand or shortening it to Dunkin. Is there going to be any changes in the product offerings or anything else that's going to go along with the name change?
Okay, so I think the name change was a really interesting example of how challenge takes place. We did a bunch of research 2 years ago. It showed that over time our product offering has evolved. It also showed what consumers want. And basically it said that we were a morning, this is all in the US, a morning company. It also showed that breakfast was our big day part. It also confirmed what we knew, that 60% of our business here is beverages, and that there was still a lot of opportunity to grow that. We were also a company built on speed, and we felt after a lot of work that we needed to modernize it. We then went out and did it, and we challenged that theory by going out and doing a bunch of consumer research, which confirmed it. There is then another part of it. As I said earlier, I run international. International has a different spin. Some countries in Southeast Asia is like 95% donuts. So we were concerned about that. So one of the things I did last year about this time, we have regional meetings around the world. We asked people in the international markets, what do you think about calling it just Dunkin' and not Dunkin' Donuts? So again, challenging it. Net result is, and I had votes in meetings like this, most people supported the change. So we constantly challenged it. To your point about the menu, earlier this year, we realized that as we're about speed, the labor shortage was putting pressure on our operations. We needed to simplify operations. So we simplified our menu. We still give our franchise owners a good deal of freedom with various products, particularly donuts. I mean, donuts is a great product in that you can celebrate local things, you can celebrate events, you can make it very topical, and it's going to sound like a Baskin-Robbins answer this. It's really the icing on the cake. And what people also find amazing when I say it is the biggest attachment to anything you buy. So if you buy a coffee, if you buy a tea, an iced tea, a sandwich, one donut, the biggest attachment to everything is a donut. So even though the name's going, it is still there. And I actually think it could actually help the donuts, because I can see a day, and this is not the plan, but I could see the day where we really sub-brand the donuts as Dunkin' Donuts, the bagels that we're the #1 bagel supplier as Dunkin' Bagels, and so on. So we simplified it. We constantly update the menu, and by simplifying it, it's easier to put new products in and take other ones out. But I think the point I want to get there, we challenged ourselves non-stop all the way through the process. All right, any more questions? Gentleman down here, Ted.
Here, I'll come to him in a second.
Oh, one here.
Yeah, I've noticed that tone is very important when you go to challenge, and I've also noticed that challenging versus a poor attitude or negative attitude, there's differences in that. Just maybe a couple tips on overall, far as maybe an employee going to challenge either their boss or their higher ups, in addition to the two-way communication that you mentioned.
Okay, so first thing I'll say, bosses are difficult. Do we all agree on that? Okay, so I have a live example of this. My son, who's 38, has a boss. So I'm always talking to him about how to position various points. And I'd also go back to what I said a few minutes ago. Most people don't like being challenged. It's a natural thing not to like it, so recognize that. So I've always taken the view is that you should do it in a very polite, gentle manner. the confrontational way of saying, you're wrong about this, or that plan is complete crap, doesn't get you anywhere. I think it's much better to say, and by the way, the private equity people seem to have a set phrase for this. I've been thinking about this, and I think it might be interesting. By the way, they say this for just about everything. So, any private equity people here? No. Okay. So, but I've been thinking about this, and I think it may be a good idea to think about doing it this way. So it needs context. And there's a really interesting study, I couldn't tell you who did it, about context. Context is about setting up the positioning of a statement, or in this case, a challenge or a question. And it said that the Europeans are very strong on context, particularly the French. In other words, they put a lot of words before they actually make the point. Americans, in contrast, don't do that. So I would encourage you to put it in context. You know, we are launching this new product. It's going on the beauty counter, I'm making this up, a beauty counter in these retailers. I'm thinking about the customers. Does this product really resonate in that way? Now, you've challenged it, but you've done it so softly, it is not saying, I think the product and the marketing is nonsense. Does that help? And I think the other thing I might say is, sometimes you can use people in a third party to help you do that. You know, I was talking to someone at a party last night, and they were saying our products don't really resonate here. Now, one of the things that is fantastic about Dunkin' Donuts, and sometimes you get too much of it, you cannot go to a party, particularly in Boston, without having 25 people come up to you and telling you what's wrong with the products, right? So it's irritating, but it's great. I mean, A, they're engaged enough to tell you, and we change things based on the feedback we get.
I have an emailed in question. Somebody says, in your days at Blockbuster Video, did anyone ever challenge leadership in any way, suggesting the imagination of what is today's Netflix?
Well, there's a whole chapter, at least, in the book on that. And Blockbuster is a really interesting test case. And the other week I did, I'm doing new things now. I do paid speeches, first time in my life. And I did this 4.5-hour session I ran. 3 hours was spent on Blockbuster. And the lessons from Blockbuster are incredible. And I think Blockbuster should still be here now, but it's not. So Blockbuster was an innovator in technology when I got to the company. By the way, it wasn't me that destroyed that. It actually had a system with a joint venture with IBM called New Leaf, where they could copy record, music, video, and movies. The movie industry rebelled against it and said, we don't like this copying thing. Net result, they created a vacuum that Napster filled, so that rebounded on that industry. Netflix, so this is the quick version of the Netflix story. We were going through challenges all the time. We used to wake up every morning with some new technology hitting our business. And we went through this mega transformation, which probably doesn't seem that mega now, of going from VHS to DVD. But think this is a whole life cycle of change. And not only one DVD, we had Blu-ray and DVD came out at the same time. And we thought, well, one's going to go and one's going to stay. Well, it didn't. I mean, so we had to handle that. Netflix kind of crept up a bit. And this is where we were wrong, and I'm part of the blame here. We saw Netflix in San Francisco starting to do very well with the DVD by mail. But we said, that's because San Francisco's got a huge internet broadband penetration. You know, and by the way, think back, this is 2002. 2002, most of us existed on narrow band. I mean, it's horrifying, isn't it? I mean, so we said it's a regional chain. Then Viacom, which was our owners, Sumner Redstone, came to us and said, hey, why don't you buy Netflix? Only 50 million. This is where we made the mistake, I think, because we said, no, it's not worth that. By the way, this shows how stupid I am. Netflix today is worth 160 billion, right? So anyway, and Reed Hastings done a fantastic job. So we then woke up when they went to Austin, and we actually launched Blockbuster online, and we launched it in the middle of '04. I left at the back end of '04. Up to '07, they were taking share from Netflix, so the momentum was going. And we had a competitive advantage because we had the stores where people could take the videos back, which they didn't have, and we also gave 4 free rentals. Big learning here for anyone in anything you do. Those 4 free rentals, the average ticket on those rentals was higher than the normal average ticket. It got people in the store, and they spent a load of money on used DVDs or whatever. So we were picking up share, and again, I wasn't there. Then an activist shareholder, Carl Icahn, came along and felt that this internet thing wasn't where the focus should be back on the stores, get Blockbuster back to its history. They tried to buy Circuit City, which, as an outsider, I have to say, I don't think it was a particularly good move. 3 years later, Blockbuster went belly up. I truly believe we made the mistake because we should have bought Netflix when we could have done, but forgetting that, we were taking market share. So the lessons from this for all of you is we probably didn't anticipate strongly the effect of broadband, which is, Netflix is the name. It's really the growth of broadband that we didn't anticipate. The other mistake we made, and this is a really, really important message, we had tested very well in the UK, Israel, and Spain, video vending machines. We then brought it to the US and did a test in Dallas, which was a failure. The thing I learned from that is most tests fail because you don't do the test properly. Right? This is very important. Whatever you do, most tests fail because you do not execute the tests well enough. So we said vending's not going to work in America, which wasn't very clever. And then Redbox came along, owned by McDonald's. They used it to drive traffic to their store. And what is amazing to me, I looked it up the other week. I looked up, bagged in my zip code, and Redbox is still there. Now, they've migrated to more games, but they're still there doing DVDs. So that was probably a bigger embarrassment as far as I'm concerned than Netflix. But the lesson for everyone, with the world picking up pace, you have to constantly look forward. And I found a great quote the other day. A leader's job is to look 18 months to the future, but make sure you've got the right people to run the business today.
And our final question for the morning.
Bosses like challenges. That's how they become bosses. How do you channel questioning, promoting a contrary idea into something productive as opposed to turning off the boss?
Well, I think it's a little bit what I said to that gentleman over there, that I think too many people go too hard at it too quickly. And I think the words of I've been thinking, or I've been talking, or I've been hearing are very good introductions to getting you on the table. The job number one is to get the boss to at least listen to a conversation. Now, everyone's different. Some bosses prefer to do it out the office. I mean, when I was at Blockbuster, a very good boss, John Antiaco, who also shares all the Netflix and vending stories with me, I could never talk to him in the office. We used to meet every Monday night for dinner. And that was very productive. So I think the first thing I would say is find the right situation, the right location. But don't just go in on whack 'em, because that makes people immediately defensive. I would find some other things to talk about and saying, I've been thinking about how we can improve our results here. Set it up, as I said before, with a lot of context. And then say, and my idea, I don't know what you think of it, so give him an out, him or her. This is the idea I think could work. What do you think, then say to him? By getting him in, you're not asking for a yes or no, you're getting him engaged in your idea. That's how I tend to do it. What do you think of that?
I think it probably promotes a better result than having Paul say that's nonsense, which would turn me off immediately.
Yeah.
It's probably a good approach, if not the perfect.
The session I did last week, where we did this group therapy for the couple, was very much about that question. That the boss didn't realize how antagonistic he was and how he was turning everyone off. And the whole group was helping this couple, who both worked there, think about how they could get to this guy. And what I gave you was basically the conclusions of the group. Now, note, I think this is an important point. I naturally don't give you just my views. I've learned by listening to what other people said about it and taking them on board.
Very well. With that, thank you, Nigel. It's great having you here.
Thank you.